Hello, fellow smelly fellas. Jezza here, and I am traumatized because I just got a power outage that lost all this video's footage. Oh boy. Here I go again. In this video, I want to talk about 10 albums that I think are super underrated in context of the artist's discographies. Not necessarily albums that are just underrated in the grand scheme of everything, just underrated compared to the other albums that the artist has made. It's not a top 10, it's not ranked, it's just this just 10. I like 10, it's a lovely number. What a fine dandy number that is, you know? To kick it off, we've got King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard with Murder of the Universe. An album that not everyone could get into because of the narration, the spoken word bits, which is a shame because behind the spoken word is some of the most interesting music King Gizzard have ever recorded. Murder of the Universe is my second favorite King Gizzard album behind only Nonagon Infinity. It's bizarre, epic, it goes really hard, it's got some of my favorite usage of time signatures, and this band does that a lot. It is so epic in scope, and yet a lot of the subject matter is just ever so humorous, yet strangely existential still. I have so much fun listening to this album. If you don't like it because of some spoken word bits, that's a shame, because there's so much fun to be had with this. Up next, we've got Everything Everything, an English pop band that are already pretty underrated in their own respect. Their 2015 album Get to Heaven is widely regarded by fans as their best, for good reason. It is, and yeah, while it's not on the same tier, the album that follows it, A Fever Dream, is still really good in its own regard. I feel like a lot of people entered A Fever Dream expecting another Get to Heaven, which is a little unfair. A Fever Dream is doing something a little more nuanced, softer, more nocturnal. There's a lot of standout tracks on this album, especially the opener, and there's not a dull moment on this album. Even the little interlude type track that comes before the closer is really good. I get it, if you are looking for another Get to Heaven, something more colorful and energetic and in your face, and maybe you feel disappointed because of that, but ignore that. Go back to the album, it's really good, and if you haven't heard it, just, you know, because no one really talks about their stuff outside of Get to Heaven, please give it a listen. Ooh, the big bad power outage is gonna get me. Up next, we've got one of my favorite bands, the Flaming Lips, with their album At War with the Mystics. This was my first Flaming Lips album, so I kinda have a bias with it, but it is the album that really sold me on the band because it is a really good album. Definitely not as good as the Soft Bulletin or Yoshimi or Embryonic, but there are so many solid tracks on this album, some of my favorite from the band. Songs like The Sound of Failure, Vein of Stars, My Cosmic Autumn Rebellion, Pompeii. I don't speak German. But yeah, this album is far better than the general consensus critically and among fans makes it out to be. We get it, it's not another Yoshimi, it's not another The Soft Bulletin, but good lord, it deserves more love than it has received. Up next, we've got David Bowie with The Next Day. Certainly better than The Big Day. Oh, ha ha ha, I'm so funny, I love making fun of low-hanging fruit. The Next Day was a pretty solid comeback album of sorts for David Bowie, and it got super overshadowed by Black Star. And sure, it doesn't have the I made this on my deathbed for the fans type narrative, but the artsy experimental style that David Bowie did fine-tune and perfect more in Black Star, he started with The Next Day. So it's just kind of interesting to me that an album that's only like one or two little steps down from Black Star is almost universally ignored compared. And, you know, those who have heard it can agree it's a solid album, but that's just it. Hardly anyone has heard it compared to the likes of David Bowie's other classics. Doesn't get nearly as much discussion or attention in the David Bowie spheres. Next, we've got the collab album between Scott Walker and Sun. Soust, I adore Scott Walker. He's got such a solid discography, and his final experimental trilogy is just oh, good experimental lord. But I cannot lie, of all the Scott Walker albums, this collab album with Sun, I have been returning to far more than any of the others. I think this collab is a match made in heaven, or hell, because this album is legitimately just a hellscape. It is one of the scariest, most sinister sounding albums I've ever heard. Scott Walker's late career experimental habits mixed with Sunno's drone metal, perfect combo. Soust just sounds like evil incarnate. Play it loud in the middle of the night, and you'll get it. Honestly, probably my favorite thing to come out of either of these artists. Objectively speaking, yes, Scott Walker definitely has some better stuff, but I do not return to that as much as I do this. Next, we've got the Mars Volta with Nocturnicate, their final album. The major complaint a lot of people have with a lot of the last few Mars Volta albums is that it just it got redundant. Their sound didn't really evolve much. They were kind of hitting on the same stuff. They got stale, which is why it's a little confusing to me that Nocturnicate, which totally changes up their sound, doesn't get the love that it deserves for doing so. Maybe you don't prefer this other sound, maybe you like their more post-hardcore stuff, but this weirder, experimental, more off-kilter style they developed for this album is pretty unique. I like hearing the Mars Volta playing a different mode than, you know, the rest of their discography. No, it is nowhere near as good as their first few, but all the hate that this album has received, it just feels bizarre to me. It ain't a classic or anything, it's not a godsend, but it definitely deserves more love. There's some pretty solid Mars Volta tracks on this. Mars Volta tracks that, again, stand out from the crowd. Next, we've got Jeff Rosenstock with his album, Post. Post definitely suffered for coming after the absolute masterpiece that was Worry, an album that is extremely hard to live up to. And I get it, a lot of people were frustrated. Post wasn't as high energy. It shifted a little away from pop punk and a little more towards indie rock. It was a little mellower. This was, in a little bit of a way, Jeff Rosenstock's ballad album. But good lord, what it does really well. And it is way too consistent to be considered one of his lesser albums. A lot of my favorite Jeff Rosenstock songs are here. USA, TV Stars, Your Throat. I get that it was a step down from Worry, which was a near perfect album, but not that many steps down. Just another album that happened to be overshadowed. Poor little fella. Next, we've got Death Grips with Government Plates, an album that a lot of people had mixed feelings about when it came out because it was a little more instrumental compared to the first three big Death Grips projects. It was a break from the norm, one that focused way more on the production than on any of the vocals. And Stefan still has a lot of cool moments on this album, but this is definitely way more of an Andy Moran type instrumental glitch hop odyssey of sorts that dabbled into some territory that a lot of people would say is definitely ahead of its time. I can still agree that it's not one of their best, but it did end up being my second most listened to behind The Powers That Be. It's that fun. For what it is, Government Plates is really solid. Next, we've got Animal Collective with Centipede Hurts. Coming after that slew of albums that Animal Collective released in the 00s, of course it was bound to be underrated. Of course, a lot of people are going to feel very mixed about this one. It totally burritoed up that windshield that was the streak from Sungtongs to Merryweather. But honestly, on top of being one of the most unique things that Animal Collective have put out, sound-wise it was a little ahead of the curve, pretty ahead of its time. There's been a lot of very celebrated albums that have come out in the last several years that have this dense, maximalist style. Albums like No Now that are just very in your face and have very, very involved production. And I can't help but look back at Centipede Hurts and wonder, you know, didn't this album do just that? And of course it didn't do it as well as some of the albums that have come out recently. But this album needs a little more love for trying this maximalist pop style as early as 2012. Last up on my silly little list is Blur with Think Tank. A lot of people think of Think Tank as one of the lesser Blur albums. It's a little mind-boggling considering how much of Damon Albarn's best songwriting is on this album. This is the album with Ambulance and Out of Time, Good Song, Battery in My Leg. There's a few duds like Crazy Beat, yeah. But what would a Blur album be without a dud or two? Am I right, ladies? But yeah, really strong effort. A lot of people's mixed reactions come from how it's not as big of a band effort. It's a little more on the electronica side. I don't know, that just kind of screams of 00's rockism. It's a solid effort. It has aged remarkably well. And with that, my funny little list has come to an end. I'd love to hear some albums that y'all think are underrated because you know what? I might put them on again. Maybe it's something that I didn't really like the first time. Maybe I'll give it a second shot, who knows? Because if the albums on this list are any proof, a lot of stuff needs a second shot. And cut. I would say that was a good second shot on this entire video. I am so glad that power outages have given me this opportunity to say the same stuff again. Feel my pain. All right, quick smooch before my power goes out. Mwah. Quick pounding. Goodbye, fellas. My name is Jack Black and I smoke crack. Mike Babber's gonna kill me.